You unlock this door with the key of curiosity. Beyond it is not just another podcast. It's a podcast of mystery. It's a podcast of monsters. A podcast of the paranormal. You are moving into a graveyard of both fiction and reality, of horror and history. You just crossed over into something gravely amusing. Hello, everyone, and welcome to another crazy ass episode of Gravely Amusing, the only horror history podcast that can hip hop, bebop, dance till you drop, and yo yo make a whipped cup of cocoa. Hello! I am your host, the man child of the macabre, Bryan Peters, and this is Gravely Amusing, a horror history podcast that discussing things on horror and sci-fi, pop culture, and stories that are just bizarre. And this is my season 2 finale. Season 2 was pretty crazy as we began last year or last March with Godzilla and Ghostbusters. I talked about Roswell and the rising paranoia. I can't even talk. Paranoia in humans with the Cold War and aliens. And we discussed horror and wrestling and different gimmicks. And I discussed Ed Gein, who's pretty much the godfather or grandfather of serial killers and horror in terms of making it very personal. And I spoke about vampires and werewolves in Hollywood. I asked if Batman should kill, and mostly a lot about aliens. And it's been a fun season. But I have to end it on what I think is one of the very best things ever created for horror, for sci-fi, for television, just in a narrative standpoint, and just historical, and just perfection, in my opinion. It has been a true inspiration for me as a writer, as a creator, as a creative genius that I am. And I'm talking about Rod Serling and his Twilight Zone. One of the greatest creative minds of all time is Rod Serling. Before Rod came along, TV was predictable. It was sponsor approved fluff stuff. It was safe. It was unchallenging. It never asked big questions. And Rod, in the midst of that, was this chain smoking genius who needed to tell stories that mattered. He needed to write things that went against the grind, went against what everyone else is doing, stuff that mattered. And he wasn't just a writer, he was a fighter, both literally and figuratively. He actually battled on the front lines in World War II, and he sparred with TV executives over censorship. And he took on society's darkest issues when a time when like nobody else would. He was known as Hollywood's angry young man, much like myself, except I'm not in Hollywood. I guess I'm the Midwest angry young man. And he clashed with television executives and sponsors all over so many issues, including censorship, racism, and war. He wanted to talk about the things that no one else wanted to talk about. He was a man after my own heart. And this is his story. So pull up a chair. If you're in your car, tell the kids to shut up. Tell your wife to quit nagging you, or tell your husband to start paying attention and stop zoning out. And let's share together the story of Rod Serling and the Twilight Zone. So Serling was born on Christmas Day in 1924 in Syracuse, New York, to a Jewish family. He was the second of two sons born to an Esther, and who was a housewife, and Samuel Lawrence Serling. Esther would die in 1958, and Samuel would die in 1945. So his father never got to see the beauty of the Twilight Zone, and his mother passed away right when it was being created. Sterling's father, so sorry, had worked as a secretary and amateur inventor actually before his children were born, but he eventually started working for his father in law as a grocer to earn a steady income because sometimes when you're inventing, sometimes people don't buy what you're inventing. And Sam would later become a butcher, actually, after the Great Depression forced the store to close. Raw, Rod had an older brother who would become a novelist and aviation writer named Robert J. Sterling. So he shared writing things in common with his brother. And Rod spent most of his youth about roughly like 70 miles south of Syracuse, where he would really grow up in Binghamton, New York. And his family would encourage his talents as a performer. Sam, his father, who was an inventor, used to building things, actually built a small stage in their basement, which is pretty badass in my opinion, where Rod would often put on plays with or without other children. And his older brother, Robert, actually recalled at the age of 6 or 7, Rod would entertain himself for hours by acting out dialogue, pulp magazines, or movies he had seen. And Rod would often ask questions of his family without actually waiting for their answers. On trips from Binghamton to Syracuse, the rest of the family sometimes remained silent to see if Rod would actually notice that they're being quiet. And he obviously did not. He would talk nonstop throughout their entire car rides. And I've never had that happen to me ever in my life when I just wanted to listen to music and drive. That has never happened to me with anyone in my life. Never happened. When Rob was in elementary school, he was seen as a class clown, and many of his teachers just saw him as a lost cause. But his seventh grade English teacher, actually, Helen Foley, much like my ninth grade English teacher, Mrs. Snodgrass, shout out to Mrs. Snodgrass, but his teacher, Helen Foley, encouraged him to enter the school's public speaking group. And he joined the debate team and he was a speaker at his high school graduation. He began writing for the school newspaper, in which, according to the journalist Gordon Sander, he became a bit of a social activist and started bringing up social issues and radical opinions and started his controversy to the norm. When Rod was a senior in high school in 1943, he gained some interest in sports, and he was actually pretty good at tennis and table tennis. I guess a lot of ping pong. Maybe ping pong wasn't invented yet. I don't know, but when he attempted to join the varsity football team, he was told he was too small at 5'4", which is pretty crazy because my boy Dre is about that height, and he could kick my ass in football. And that has nothing to do with the fact I'm morbidly obese, out of shape, and barely understand the concept of foosball. But Rod, with not being able to join foosball, Rod decided to do his own thing. Rod was interested in radio and writing at an early age, and like me, he was obsessed with storytelling. He was an avid radio listener. He was especially interested in thrillers, fantasy, and horror shows. There was a writer named Arch Obler who wrote for a horror show called Lights Out, and another writer named Norman Corwin, who was more than a writer. He was a screenwriter, producer, and teacher of journalism and writing. And Corwin was among one of the first producers to regularly use entertainment to tackle serious social issues. He was a peer of Orson Welles, and he was very influential and successful in creating and performing arts. And He would inspire people such as Ray Bradbury, Robert Altman, and someone you might know, Robin Williams. And those two men were his favorite writers. So someone who wrote horror and someone that was very much using entertainment to tackle social issues. So so Rod did some staff work at Binghamton radio station and he tried to write, but nothing was ever published while he was working at the radio station. He would be accepted into college during his senior year of high school, but the United States was involved in World War II at the time, and Sterling decided to enlist in the war rather than start college immediately. So, as when he before he went to war, as an editor of his high school paper, Sterling encouraged his fellow students to support that war effort. And he wanted to actually leave school before graduation to join the fight, but his teachers talked him into waiting for graduation. His civics teacher specifically told him, "War is a temporary thing; it ends. Education doesn't. Without your degree, where will you be after the war?" Very good point, and part of why some athletes actually care about their school, because if they suck as an athlete, what are you gonna do? What are you gonna do? Sterling would enlist in the U.S. Army the morning after he graduated high school, and he would follow his brother Robert. Sterling began his military career in 1943 at Camp Tokia. I hope I said that right. Tokia, Georgia, under General Joseph May Swing and a Colonel Orrin D. Hagen. And he served in the 511th Parachute Infantry Regiment of the 11th Airborne Division. And he eventually would reach the rank of technician 4th grade. He couldn't pass 5th grade. After the next year of paratrooping with Steve Wilson Falcon, Sterling and others began boxing to kind of vent their aggression and deal with the buildup of emotion and frustration being in war. He competed as a flyweight. He had about 17 fights, and he would go to the second round of the division finals, but he was knocked out. He was remembered for his Wolverine-like berserker style and for getting his nose broken in his first and his last bout, which is quite an accomplishment. He did try to win a Golden Glove, but he failed. Probably because he broke his nose again. On April 25th, 1944, Sterling received his orders, and he saw that they were going to send him to West California, and he knew that he would be fighting the Japanese, which is what he did not want. He wanted to go off to fight Hitler directly. He wanted to whoop Hitler's ass and be Captain America, but he was stuck being Falcon. So in May, unfortunately, he was assigned to the Pacific Theater in New Guinea and the Philippine Islands. And troops of the 511th Infantry first saw combat when they landed in the Philippines. So he first saw combat in November 1944. And the 11th Airborne Division was not used as paratroopers anymore, but they became like a light infantry during the Battle of Leyte. The division would help secure the area after 5 divisions that had gone ashore earlier. So Rod was very much against authority and against the grind, especially in war. And for a variety of reasons, Sterling was transferred to the 511th Demolition Platoon, which was nicknamed the Death Squad because it had high casualties. So basically, he was sent to this death squad to die because he was a pain in the ass. According to Sergeant Frank Lewis, that was a leader of that demolition squad, Rod screwed up something along the line. Apparently, he got on a lot of people's nerves. So Lewis also said that Serling was not really suited to be a field soldier. He didn't have the wits or aggressiveness required for combat, which is probably why he wasn't that great at boxing. At one point, Lewis, Serling, and others were in a firefight, and they were trapped in a foxhole. And as they waited for darkness, Lewis noticed that Serling had not reloaded any of his ammo. And Serling sometimes would go exploring on his own against orders, got lost, basically didn't want to be there and hated everything about it, and probably felt that he made a bit of a mistake. But Serling's time in the war shaped his writing and his political views for the rest of his life. He would see death every day. He would see innocent people being killed. He would see Japanese being killed. He would see so much death. And he would see freak accidents such as as something that killed another Jewish private named Melvin Levy. Levy was actually like a comic for the platoon, and he was delivering a monologue, and they decided to rest under a tree, and food crate dropped from a plane above and decapitated the dude. And Serling and everybody saw the whole dang thing. Serling would lead these funeral services for Levy, and he placed a Star of David over his grave. Serling later sent several of his scripts that he would write in the Philippines about everything. And, as things were in his head, he wrote scripts. And he used the unpredictability of death as a theme in some of his writing. And actually, in an episode, I believe it was called The Purple Testament, Rod writes, Infantry Platoon, U.S. Army, Philippine Islands, 1945. These are the faces of the young men who fight. As some omniscient painter had mixed a tube of oils that were at one time earth brown, dust gray, blood red, beard black, and fear yellow white. And these men were the models. For this is the province of combat, and these are the faces of war. Serling returned from the successful mission in Leyte with 2 wounds, including one to his kneecap, but neither kept him from combat when General Douglas MacArthur deployed the paratroopers for their usual purpose on February 3rd, 1945. Carl Hagen led the 511th Parachute Infantry Regiment as it landed on Tagaytay Ridge and marched into Manila. It met minimal resistance until it reached the city, where Vice Admiral Senji Awabuchi had arranged his 17,000 troops behind a maze of traps and guns and ordered them to fight to the death. During the next month, Serling's unit battled block by block for control of Manila. And when portions of the city were taken from Japanese control, local civilians would sometimes show their gratitude by throwing parties and hosting banquets. And during one of these parties, Serling and his comrades were actually fired upon, resulting in many soldier and civilian deaths. Serling, who was actually still a private after 3 years and didn't move up at all, caught the attention of Sergeant Lewis when he actually ran into the line of fire to rescue a performer who had been on the stage when the artillery started firing. So he showed that he had balls, despite everything that was said about him. So Serling's regiment didn't have many, had a 50% casualty rate with over 400 men killed or wounded. And Serling was wounded and 3 comrades were killed by shrapnel from rounds fired. And he was sent to New Guinea to recover, but soon had to return to Manila to finish cleaning up the mess. And Serling's final assignment was part of the occupation force in Japan, And during that military service, Sterling was awarded the Purple Heart, the Bronze Star, and the Philippine Liberation Medal, among others. Sterling's combat experience affected him deeply and influenced much of his writing, which is why I brought it up. And it would leave him with nightmares and flashbacks for pretty much the rest of his life. And he would say that he was bitter about everything. And when I got out of service, I think I turned to writing to get it off my chest. After being discharged from the Army in 1946, Sterling actually worked at a rehabilitation hospital while recovering from his wounds. His knees would trouble him for years, mainly because he was a paratrooper and because of the damage. Later, his wife Carol became accustomed to the sound, she said, of him falling down the stairs when his knee would buckle because of this. But when he was fit enough, he used those federal GI bills and any benefits he had and disability payments to enroll in physical education program at Antioch College in Yellow Springs, Ohio, not far from where I live. And he'd been accepted to Antioch, which was his brother's alma mater, while in high school. So after the Army, he just went to where he was accepted. And he went into theater department and to broadcasting, which is what I want to go into and I should go into. But I am an English major, and Rod actually changed his major to literature, and he would get a bachelor's degree in 1950. And part of his studies, Sterling became active in the campus radio station, which I mentioned earlier, an experience that would prove very useful in his future career. He would write, direct, and act in many radio programs on campus and then around the state. And as part of his work study, he would do that as well. And here he met Carolyn Louise Kramer, who's a fellow student who would become his wife. And at first, she wouldn't date him because he was considered a ladies' man. He was a bit promiscuous and had that reputation, but she eventually would change her mind. And he would actually join the Unitarian Church in college and marry Carol and in July 31st, 1948. And they would have two daughters, Jody, born in 52, and an Anne, born in 55. Now, during college, she was pretty darn poor. And to earn extra money in his college years, Sterling worked part time testing parachutes for the United States, even with his bad knees. And according to his coworkers, he received like $50 for each successful jump. And once was paid, and this was in the 50s, so this was, big money. He once been paid $500, half before and half if he survived, for hazardous tests. And he did do a jump before his wedding. And in one instance, he supposedly earned like $1,000 for testing a jet ejection seat that had killed three previous people. So, yeah, $1,000, 1950, risking your life. Let's look at the inflation calculator here. Inflation calculator, US dollars. Let's take a look here. So, if in 1950, what was it? 1948. 1948. If I got something for $1,000, so he was paid the equivalent of $13,181 for testing something that could kill somebody. Yeah, why not? Serling also volunteered at WNYC in New York as an actor and writer in the summer of 46. And the next year, he worked at a station as a paid intern in his Antioch work study program. And he would take odd jobs in radio stations in New York and Ohio and bounce back between, Binghamton and New York, kind of where his family was, and Ohio, where his school was. And while he also attended college, Sterling worked at the Antioch Broadcasting Systems Radio Workshop. He managed the radio station within a couple of years, and he took charge of full-scale radio productions at Antioch, which were broadcast on WJEM. WJEM in Springfield. He wrote and directed the programs, and he acted in them when it was needed. And he created the entire output for 1948 to 1949 school year. And all the writing that year was his original work. And while in college, Sterling won his first accolade as a writer. He wrote a radio program, Dr. Christian, and he had started this annual script writing contest 8 years earlier, and thousands of scripts were sent annually. He won a contest for the radio program Dr. Christian for a script he wrote called To Live a Dream. My apologies. He and his new wife Carol would attend the awards broadcasts, and he would be interviewed by the star of Dr. Christian, Gene Hurlslot, and be kind of network that way and kind of get accolades that way. And he would work as a copywriter for the radio station and just various jobs, just trying to create scripts and get things moving along. And he would earn basically about $45 to $50 a week at college radio stations and try to sell the scripts left and right. But unfortunately, at that time, the industry was involved in many lawsuits, which made them unwilling to kind of take on new writers. And some scripts be rejected, or say they were rejected, so they didn't pay the person writing the script. And then a similar plot would be produced and claim the work. Oh, I'm so sorry. Part of the lawsuit would be that a script would be rejected, and then a similar plot would be produced, and people would claim their work had been stolen and sued the studios. So they weren't hiring new writers. And I guarantee you they were stealing those. As a writer myself and a creator myself, I know they probably stole these ideas. And Sterling was rejected for so many reasons, such as heavy competition and because of this legal stuff. He would be told this script lacks professional quality. He'd be told that our audience doesn't want to listen to this, and just a whole bunch of stuff. But in 1949, Martin Horrell of Grand Central Station, a radio program known for basically drama, romance stuff, things like that, rejected one of Sterling's scripts about boxing because his mostly female listeners, they wouldn't like that story. So Horrell put into Rod's head that this script would be far better for sight and not sound, or better for sight instead of sound only, which is where Rod put in kind of the intro to Twilight Zone. You're entering a world of sight, not just sound or something like that. Because in any radio presentation, the fights are not seen, and if you put it in front of the TV, then we can get something. So Rod, then realizing that his story would be better for TV, he submitted a piece called Hop Off the Express and Grab a Local, which became his first nationally broadcast piece in September of 1949. And his Dr. Christian script aired on September 30th that year. So in 1950, because of this, Sterling began his professional writing career officially, and he would earn $75 a week in the network area of Cincinnati, Ohio. And while at WLW in Cincinnati, he continued to freelance, and he sold several radio and television scripts to WLW's parent company, Crosley Broadcasting Corp. And after selling the scripts, Sterling had no further involvement with them, and they would be sold to Crosley at local stations across the U.S. And as he's selling these scripts and trying to make money, he tries to get as creative as he can, and he submitted an idea for a weekly radio show in which the ghosts of a young boy and girl killed in World War II would look through train windows and comment on day-to-day human life as the train moved around the country, which actually sounds kind of interesting. And the idea would be changed significantly, but was eventually kind of produced in October 1950 to February 1951, and it would be turned into a radio show called Adventure Express. And they changed it to just a drama about a girl and boy who travel by train with their uncle. They're not dead, they're not ghosts. But each week they found adventure in a new town and got involved with the local residents. So, what they did for money, how they changed clothes, uh, I don't know. So, he would write many different scripts for different radio stuff and meet some people that would help him in the Twilight Zone in the future. And Serling said of his time as a staff writer for radio, he said, from a writing point of view, radio ate up ideas that might have put food on the table for weeks at a future freelancing date. The minute you tie yourself down to a radio or TV station, you write around the clock. You rip out ideas, many of them irreplaceable. They go on and consequently can never go on again. And you sold them for $50 a week. You can't afford to give away ideas. They're too damn hard to come by. And if I had to do it over, I wouldn't staff write at all. I'd find some other way to support myself while getting a start as a writer. I don't blame him. And so Sterling believed radio was not living up to its potential. And he later said, radio in terms of drama dug its own grave. It had aimed downward, had become cheap and unbelievable, and it willingly settled for second best. He believed that if you were a radio writer, you would not be remembered for your literary contribution. This was not enough for him. And honest to God, I can't name really much of any radio writers in my life. Not because it is before my time, but you can't remember any. But in an interview in 1990, his wife said this about Rod. She said, I think Rod would have been one of the first to say he hit the new industry television in exactly the right time. The first job he got out of school was a continuity writer at a radio station, WLW, in Cincinnati. He worked there for over a year before he could freelance. At that point, he was really working on television scripts. In 1951 and 1952, the new industry was grabbing up a lot of material and they needed it. It was a very important time to be graduating from school and getting ready to find a profession. And TV was the one. So Serling moved from radio to television as a writer for WKRC TV in Cincinnati, and his duties include writing testimonial advertisements for stupid medical remedies and scripts for a comedy duo. And he continued at WKRC after graduation, and amidst the mostly boring day-to-day work, he created a series of scripts for a live television program called The Storm, as well as other anthology dramas. And this format was actually in demand by networks based in New York. During, anthology stuff, you had the coming of, you have kind of like Boris Karloff's anthology show kind of going on. Hitchcock would do an anthology show very soon. So it was kind of growing in that. And, and following classes, he would spend evenings on his own writing. He sent manuscripts to publishers and received 40 rejection slips during these years. By 1950, Serling hired Blanche Gaines as an agent, and his radio scripts received more rejections, so he began rewriting them for television. So basically, he would write a script, and if it was rejected for radio, he sent to TV. If it was rejected for TV, he sent to radio. and he would just submit it over and over and over again. The man was a beast. And as Serling's college years ended, his scripts began to sell, finally. And he continued to write for television and eventually left WKRC to become a full time freelance writer. He, he said writing is a demanding profession and a selfish one. And because it is selfish and demanding, because it's compulsive and exacting, I didn't embrace it. I succumbed to it. Yeah, my man. And according to his wife, she said Serling just up and quit one day during the winter of 52, about 6 months before our first daughter was born. And though he was also doing some freelancing and working on a weekly drama show for another Cincinnati station, he he pretty much just quit writing for other people and did freelance. And they would move to Connecticut, and he made a living by writing for live dramatic anthology shows at the time, and including working for Kraft Television Theater, and appointed with and for the Hollywood or for the Hallmark Hall of Fame. And by the end of 1954, his agent convinced him he needed to move to New York, where the action is. In 1955, the nationwide Kraft Television Theater televised a program based on Sterling's 72nd script. And to Sterling, like, it was just another script, and he blew it off, and he missed the first live broadcast of that. And he and his wife hired a babysitter for the night and told her that no one would call because he just moved to town. And suddenly, because of that script, the phone just started ringing, and it didn't stop for years. And the title of that episode was Patterns, and it changed his life. Patterns was Patterns was basically a dramatized show that was like a power struggle rivalry thing between a veteran corporate boss that was running out of ideas and this young executive being groomed to take his place. And this boss didn't fire this employee and risk tarnishing his own reputation. The boss actually makes him do a campaign to push aside his competition. So Sterling modeled the character of the boss on his former commander. And New York Times critic Jack Gould called the show one of the high points of the TV medium's evolution and said, for sheer power of narrative, forcefulness of characterization, and brilliant climax, Sterling work is a creative triumph. So many great reviews with this show. Yeah. So immediately following the broadcast of Patterns, Sterling was given so many offers with permanent jobs, congratulations, and requests for novels, plays, and television or radio scripts. And all those lower quality things that he had sitting around that were never published, he sold all of them. But critics would express concern that he wasn't living up to his promise of how well he did in Patterns because he was selling them all this crap they couldn't sell before. But he eventually would write something called I can't even talk. Redeeming for a Heavyweight for a television series called Playhouse 90. And he would gain some more praise. So in autumn of 1957, the Sterling family would move to California when television was new. And when television was new, like, shows aired live from New York. But as studios began to tape their shows, the business moved from the East Coast to the West Coast. So they would live for California for most of the rest of the year. So the early years of television were pretty difficult for writers, and especially Rod Serling, because television would see sponsors working as editors and censors. So Serling was forced to change his scripts after corporate sponsors would read them and find something they felt was too controversial. And they were wary of anything they thought might make them look bad to consumers. So basically, like, so they would take out like social issues, anything controversial, anything that would piss somebody off. or, basically get them canceled, just like today's world. So, as it references anything that might compete commercially with a sponsor. So, if one sponsor, sold, you know, if one sponsor sold Coke, and one sponsor was, Pepsi, they couldn't have someone drinking Coke or Pepsi because it would compete against each other. So, like, for instance, Rod wrote a line, got a match, and that was deleted because one of the sponsors for the show was a lighter company. So, can't ask for a match. You have to ask for a lighter. so, so he eventually, so this King for a Heavyweight was a storyline. I'm sorry. He eventually wrote a storyline of his teleplay Noon on Doomsday, and this was set in the southern United States, and it was about a lynching of a Jewish pawnbroker. And when Sterling mentioned in a radio interview that was inspired by events of racism that led to the murder of Emmett Till, censorship advertisers and TV network, they changed the script big time. And the program was changed in New England, and it was concerned to the killing of an unknown foreigner. And it removed any type of racial things or anything. And that's the only way the CBS would produce it. And so Rod Sterling had to fight executive interference before getting the play on air. And if they would have showed it their original way, viewers would have been amazed. So Rod Sterling was so frustrated by seeing his scripts removed with political statements and ethnic identities, and there was even a moment where the Chrysler building was removed from a script because the thing was sponsored by Ford. So Sterling decided the only way to avoid artistic interference was he had to create his own show. In an interview with Mike Wallace, he said, "I don't want to fight anymore. I don't want to have battles, sponsors, and agencies. I don't want to have to push for something that I want and have to settle for second best. I don't want to have a compromise all the time," which is what television writers do, if they want to put on controversial themes. So the Twilight Zone was born. So Sterling submitted the time element to CBS, intending it to be a pilot for his new weekly show, The Twilight Zone. And instead, CBS used the science fiction script for a new show produced by Desi Arnaz and Lucille Ball, Westinghouse Dissolute Playhouse. And in this 1958, the story concerns a man who's having vivid nightmares of the attack on Pearl Harbor. And the man goes to a psychiatrist, and after the session, there's a twist ending where Rod Sterling would be very famous for twist endings. And that's where M. Night Shyamalan ripped it off. Pretty much any movie you see a twist ending in, mostly M. Night Shyamalan, they pretty much got it for Rod Sterling. Like he was the godfather of it. So the twist ending was that the patient had died at Pearl Harbor, and the psychiatrist was the only one having the vivid dreams. And this episode that they took from him and didn't make his own show with and gave it to Lucille Ball and Desi Arnaz, it received so much positive fan response that CBS agreed to let Sterling go for his pilot, The Twilight Zone. And on October 2nd, 1959, The Twilight Zone, created by Rod Sterling, premiered on CBS to end out the decade. And for this series, Sterling fought so hard to get and maintain creative control. He hired scriptwriters he respected, such as Richard Matheson and Charles Beaumont. And Sterling said the show's science fiction format would not be controversial with sponsors, network executives, or the general public, and would escape this censorship, unlike earlier scripts. So Sterling drew on his own experience for many episodes, frequently about boxing, military life, airplane pilots, and the Twilight Zone would incorporate his views on racial relations, and he would twist that into stories of science fiction and fantasy for the shows. So, but sometimes like the meaning, the message of the show would be kind of blunt, like in the episode "I Am the Night, Color Me Black," in which hatred caused a dark cloud and to form in a small town in the American Midwest and spread across the world. So, an episode of The Twilight Zone, if you've never seen it, it usually opens with that music, like I had in the early beginning of this episode, and would open with Rod kind of describing somewhat like a parable, like not necessarily an Aesop fable, but Rod believed that if he could take social stories and controversial stories and kind of put them as a parable and add some sci-fi in there, he could get the message across that he was trying to in such a creative way. So Twilight Zone is like Aesop's fables, but thrown into sci-fi or parables, just parables. Like Jesus taught parables. Like it would be a parable with a sci-fi twist, and and there usually would be a twist at the end that you never saw coming that would really hit at home the whole point of what he was saying. And the Twilight Zone would air for 5 seasons, and the first 3 seasons were like half-hour episodes. The fourth went to hour-long episodes, but then the fifth returned to the half-hour format. It would win many television and drama awards, critical acclaim for Serling and his coworkers. But even though it had loyal fans, the Twilight Zone, interesting enough, would have kind of moderate ratings, and it was actually canceled twice and revived. But but after 5 years, Rod would do 156 episodes. Well, the show would do 156 episodes, which 92 of them would be written by Serling himself, and he eventually just got exhausted with the series. And in 1964, he decided not to oppose his third cancellation and just let it die. Serling sold the rights to the Twilight Zone to CBS, and his wife would say that he pretty much did this because he believed his production company would never be able to recoup all the production costs of the programs, which would go over budget. So he was kind of losing money. And the Twilight Zone, Rod in the 60s would eventually do a show called Night Gallery, which was more horror based. And we'll talk about that in a future episode. But the Twilight Zone eventually resurfaced in the form of a 1983 film by Warner Brothers, and it would be narrated by Twilight Zone actor Burgess Meredith, who's known to be Mickey in the Rocky movies. You eat lightning and crop thunder, and known as the Penguin in the 1960s Adam West Batman show. And there have been 3 attempts to revive this series with mostly like new scripts, new ideas, trying to make it like more modern. And that would be done in 1985 with Charles Amen and I think later Robin Ward as the narrators. It was tried to revive in 2002 by UPN with Forrest Whitaker, and most recently in 2019 with Jordan Peele doing that for Paramount Plus as that streaming service launched. The Twilight Zone is widely regarded as one of the greatest television series of all time. In 2002, the series was ranked number 26 on TV Guide's 50 Greatest TV Shows of All Time. In 2004, it was ranked number 8 on TV Guide's Top Cult Shows Ever. In 2013, the Writers Guild of America ranked it as the 3rd best written TV series ever. And TV Guide ranked it as the 4th greatest drama, the 2nd greatest sci-fi show, and the 5th greatest show of all time. In 2016, it was ranked number 7 on Rolling Stone's list of the 100 greatest shows of all time. It's rated very high. so, so I'm now going to give you what, are the, in my opinion, are the best episodes of the Twilight Zone, in my personal opinion. So, number 10 of my top 10 Twilight Zone episodes, and there's so many good ones. So, this was not easy to make. My honorable mention is The Howling Man, which is in season 2, episode 5. And that episode is basically about a guy who hears a howling, and it turns out to be the devil in prison. And that's all I'm going to say. Number 10 on my list is the pilot episode from season 1, episode 1, which is entitled Where Is Everybody? In this episode, a man finds a town and nobody's in it. And it's a story of isolation and loneliness and craziness it could cause you, which basically happens to me as I work from home and I have no children. So I go pretty crazy. So this episode is what sold the show and definitely should be considered one of the best because it's what sold the show. Number 8 is, and some of these are interchangeable. So some of these are not necessarily in going up in rank, except for maybe the top. I would say the top 4, or I'm very solid on my top 4. But number 9 is It's a Good Life, and that episode it's about the only town left in America in Ohio, and it's basically ruled over by this sociopathic kid who can read minds. And basically, if you think anything badly of him or the things he does, he can read your mind and he'll just kill you. And he can just kind of like make anything happen and he can read minds. It is pretty darn cool. It's a cool episode. Number 8 for me is probably, let me think. Number 8, I'm probably going to have to go with Will the Martians Please Stand Up? And Will the Martians Please Stand Up is from season 2, episode 28. And in that it's basically like a mystery. Like it's not a murder mystery, but it's like a mystery where basically a flying object crashes into a pond and it disappears. And there's like no doubt about it that one of the patrons in a diner is an alien. And no one can leave until they figure out who is the alien. And it does have a nice twist ending, of course. The next one is from season 5, episode 6. It's called Living Doll. It pretty much explains itself that it's basically the blueprint for Chucky and especially the blueprint for Megan. Like Megan is a total ripoff of this episode. Pretty much. Next up on there is number 6. The monsters are due on Maple Street. And in that episode, the electricity goes out in the neighborhood. Nobody can fix it. But there's one car that's able to function. And all of a sudden, everybody starts suspecting each other of being an alien. So it's kind of like, will the real Martian please stand up? But they start pointing figures on what they view as unusual behavior. And like, for example, like a man stares into a space light or stares into space late at night, and they don't know if he's either an alien or he just has insomnia and he likes to watch the stars. It's crazy like that. Number 5 is the very, very popular and stars the guy that played Jaws and the guy who played Lurch, is called To Serve Man. And I mean, you watch this and you know something's going to go wrong. at the end. And one of the earlier episodes of The Simpsons parried this episode so well. I, I'll say no more. But basically, aliens have people, and they have, yeah, and it says to serve man, and that's all I'm gonna say. Number four, I'm very, very much sold on this being my number four, and it is Nightmare at 20,000 Feet. This is an iconic episode. It is a scary episode, and it stars William Shatner as a man who's just spent 6 months in a nut house after having a nervous breakdown on an airplane. His doctor said he's cured, but now he's on another plane and he's about to fly into a storm. And basically, he says that there is a monster on the wing of the plane, basically like a gremlin. It has been parodied also by The Simpsons and in Treehouse of Horror, and it is one of the best episodes of TV and The Twilight Zone. The next one on my number three is one that I find very creepy. I find it very interesting, and I really, really enjoy this episode. It's from season 5, episode 25. And also, Serve Man is from season 3, episode 24. Nightmare at 20,000 Feet is from season 5, episode 3. So The Masked is season 5, episode 25. And it is about, it's called The Masks. And basically, it's about this rich guy, and his offspring are cynical, greedy, and rude. And on his deathbed, so kind of Knives Out takes from this a little bit. And on his deathbed, Mr. Foster invites him to his home in New Orleans on Mardi Gras. And if they can fulfill his last request, they will inherit his fortune and estate. The request is simple. They have to wear a mask he assigns them until midnight. And it's awesome. And these masks are like ugly, they're grotesque, they're uncomfortable to the wearer, and they show what he thinks of them, and it has one of the best and most satisfying twists at the end. It is an awesome, awesome episode. Number two is what a lot of people list as their number one episode, and it's understandable. It's really one of the best episodes of TV ever, and The Twilight Zone. I remember this episode and my number one are the episodes I remember the most, and I'll never forget my Aunt Carol. Rest in peace, Aunt Carol. I love you so much. My Aunt Carol is responsible for so much of my personality and so much of the things I love. And she showed me Twilight Zone on the Twilight Zone on VHS, and she said, "You got to watch this." And I was just a kid, and this episode scared me, and I'll never forget it. And it was nuts. And that is, of course, season 2, episode 6, The Eye of the Beholder. This episode is so genius in writing. It is so good. And the twist at the end is something you'll never see coming ever. If you've never heard of this episode, if you've never watched it, and you say you saw it coming, you're no, you did. You're a liar. So the point the plot of this episode is there's a woman named Mrs. Tyler, and she's had dozens and dozens of procedures on her face, and her condition is so severe, the doctors have run out of options, and they they believe that this is their final shot at normalcy, acceptance, and happiness. And she waits for her face to heal, and her face is covered in bandages the whole episode, and all she can see is darkness. And if the surgery on her face proves unsuccessful, she will be sent away by the government, which emphasizes conformity and segregation as positives. So if they can't fix her face and how she looks, she will be sent away forever because she is disfigured horribly. So good. So good. But my number one is from season 1, episode 8. And If you haven't, if you're a Twilight Zone fan, you haven't guessed it yet. Yeah, it's my opinion the best one, and it is called "Time Enough at Last." And I think this episode symbolizes Twilight Zone to the T in terms of science fiction, in terms of parables, maybe parables more than science fiction. But what happens at the end is just so like, oh my gosh. So it stars Burgess Meredith, and and it and he plays a character named Henry, and Henry is basically he works at a bank, and he has a wife that's really rude to him, and all he wants to do in life is just read David Copperfield. He just wants to read books and be left alone. And he gets locked in the safe of his bank and the vault, and a nuclear explosion happens. And basically, he's left as the last man on earth with his books. And I'll leave it at that. And it is amazing. This episode is so good. The way it ends is just, oh my gosh. It's really good. And thus ends season 2 of Gravely Amusing. This episode went a little bit longer than I wanted to, but well, no, around when I wanted to. I hope that you enjoyed the history of Ron Sterling and what built him to create the Twilight Zone. You know, the life of wanting to be a storyteller, of being different, of wanting to hit on social differences and diversity. And we live in a world now where diversity is not welcomed anymore. It's being shut down, where people aren't allowed to have a voice, and creativity is is not really wanted anymore. It's a scary world, and Rod talked about this and he embraced these differences. And the Twilight Zone is such a wonderful, wonderful show, and I hope you really check it out and embrace Rod's creativity and how his life of trauma and being around death created just something just so wonderful in this show. So, yeah, so thus ends the season 2 of Gravely Music. Check out past episodes on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Radio, and wherever you like to listen to podcasts. I will be taking a extended break from podcasting to focus on school and time with my wife as a as my schedule has changed at work and I now get no weekends off or time with her. So I'm trying to take any time I can. so so I'll look forward to August this year as we open with season 3 and we talk about the book, movie, and the legacy of Norman Bates, and that core story is Psycho. I hope this thrilled you. I hope it shocked you. I hope it horrified you. And if nothing else, I hope it left you gravely amused. See you in a few months.